Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's exciting presentation, The Bridge of Spies, the story of Francis Gary Powers and U.S.-Russia relations. My name is Samuel Holliday, and I have the great privilege of serving as Director of Operations and Scholarship for the United States Capitol Historical Society. And we're so grateful that so many of you are taking time out of your busy day to join us for this important, timely, and exciting conversation. As we get started with today's program, I'd love to just briefly review some of the technical housekeeping matters, the ways we like to use this Zoom webinar platform to engage with you nationwide and in some cases worldwide. If you have content-based questions for our presenters today, Gary and Dr. Hammond, you can put those questions into the Q&A section of the webinar, which looks like two speech bubbles, either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on what sort of device you're using to join us today. Now, if you have any technical troubleshooting matters, if you think you're having trouble seeing or hearing us through the course of today's program, you can put those sort of troubleshooting questions into the chat section, which I will answer in real time. But once again, any content questions for Gary Powers or Dr. Hammond can go into the Q&A section of the webinar. It's now also my great pleasure to introduce the President and CEO of the United States Capitol Historical Society, Jane Campbell, who will introduce our speakers and start today's program. Jane?
Thanks, Sam. Sam, you have to start the video because you stopped it.
There we go.
Okie doke. There we go. Well, welcome, welcome, welcome. It is certainly an honor to be here with you all today on this fascinating conversation that we have planned. As you know, our public history series takes advantage of the opportunity to look at things that have gone on in the past and things that are going on now and how those things might relate one to another. Today, we are going back to the Cold War and looking at today as we look at the question of Russian-American relations. We have two distinguished speakers, Francis Gary Powers, who goes by Gary, and let me tell you about him. Gary lectures internationally, appears regularly on C-SPAN, History, Discovery, and A&E channels. He's the author of Enemy Territory, Spy Pilot, and Letters from a Soviet Prison, all of which help to dispel misinformation about his father's U-2 incident. He's the founder and chairman of the Cold War Museum, located in Vint Hill, Virginia, outside of DC. And he chaired the Presidential Advisory Committee for Cold War Theme Study. And as such, he worked with the National Park Service and leading Cold War experts to identify historic Cold War sites for preservation. He also wanted to make sure that we told you that he has a BA in philosophy, a master's degree in public administration and U.S. history. So while he tells with passion the story of his father's imprisonment and ultimate release in a prisoner exchange, he tells it not only as a son, but also as a historian. Joining Gary is Dr. Andrew Hammond. Dr. Hammond is a historian and curator at the International Spy Museum, where he hosts the hit podcast called Spycast. He's a public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, has taught international relations and modern history on both sides of the Atlantic, and supplied expert commentary to outlets from the BBC, CNN, the Washington Post, and the Guardian. He has a first-class BA, a master's with distinction, and a PhD from the University of Warwick. He's held fellowships at the Library of Congress, the British Library, New York University, and was a Mellon Public Humanities Fellow at the 9/11 Memorial Museum. He served in the Royal Air Force with secondments to the British Army Headquarters Intelligence Unit and to a Royal Navy Fleet Photo Unit. His upcoming book, Struggles for Freedom, the United States Policy and Afghanistan since 1979, will be published in 2023. He's also working on a book that tells the story of 9/11 and the global war on terror through the voices of military and intelligence veterans. So you can see that we have two amazing speakers. And so we're going to start with Gary, who I understand has a video because there was a movie that even Tom Hanks was in telling this story. So with joy, I turn the podium over to Gary. Welcome and thank you.
All right, Jane, thank you very much for the introduction. Sam, thank you for all you're doing to help preserve history of the Capitol Hill. And Andrew, it's great to be with you on this program. So today we'll be talking a little bit about Cold War history, the U-2 incident, and specifically the spy exchange between my father and Soviet spy Colonel Rudolph Abel. To start, I'm going to show a quick 2.5-minute movie clip from the movie Bridge of Spies. This movie came out in 2015. It stars Tom Hanks as James Donovan. James Donovan is the attorney who brokered the exchange between my father and Soviet spy Rudolph Abel that ended up in 1962, February 10th with the exchange. He was Rudolph Abel's attorney. So during this time period, 1950s, Spielberg uses his genius to bring this historic event to life. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll start. Just give me 1 second to get to the right place. All right, and here we go. The introduction to the movie Bridge of Spies, about a 2.5-minute movie trailer.
You've been selected for a mission which you are not to discuss with anyone outside of this room. We are engaged in a war with the Soviet Union. This war does not for the moment involve men at arms. It involves information.
Something important has come up.
We've got a Soviet spy.
But there's a wrinkle.
They got our spy pilot. With a head full of classified information. The Russians want their man back before he cracks. We want you to negotiate the swap.
I'm an insurance lawyer. I'm not sure I want to pick that up.
Are you good at what you do?
This will be a first for the both of us.
You should be careful.
I'm talking to you about the security of your country.
Why aren't we hanging him? He's a spy!
You're asking me to violate the Constitution.
Do you know how people will look at us? The family of a man trying to free a traitor?
Everyone deserves a defense. Every person matters. Where do they want this negotiation?
East Berlin.
Just tell me that you're not going to be in any danger. I don't even care if it's the truth. Give me something to hold on to.
We need to have the conversation our governments can't.
People in my country consider this an act of war.
You can call it what you want. Let's be clear. Nobody is safe.
We're in a battle for civilization.
The Constitution, it's what makes us Americans. Shouldn't we show our enemies who we are?
Things have started to fall apart.
Is this your position or your government's?
Is there any outcome here where I'm not either detained or shot?
Do we need to worry about you?
What's the move when you don't know what the game is?
The next mistake our countries make could be the last one.
So that was a quick 2.5-minute movie clip, the trailer for the movie Bridge of Spies. Came out in 2015. When I first found out about this movie, I thought it was a rumor. I'm thinking Steven Spielberg, he's not going to do this movie. He has no reason to do this movie. But then I get confirmation that he's going to do this movie that will portray my father. My first thoughts, how do you get in touch with Steven Spielberg? It just can't pick up the phone. Very busy man, everybody wants a piece of him. So I reached out to some friends in Hollywood, could not get an introduction. I resorted to Google, typed in his name, his movies, up popped people he worked with, typed in their names, found some of their email addresses. So I sent out an unsolicited email to about 5 or 6 of his contemporaries, basically saying the following. Hello, my name's Gary Powers Jr. I'd like to talk to Mr. Spielberg about this movie that will portray my father. It's very important that we express the Powers family's concerns. If he bases the portrayal of my dad off the misinformation of the time, they'll be painting him in a negative light. If they base it off the declassified information that's come to surface the last 50 plus years, they'll be painting him as a hero to our country. So for obvious reasons, I wanted to reach out and try to establish contact. As a result of that email, I get a phone call from Mark Platt. He is the producer on the film. He's better known for his production of Wicked on Broadway. So Mark and I talked for about an hour in July of 2014. At the end of the conversation, he goes, hey, Mr. Powers, thank you so much for reaching out to us. You're very knowledgeable on the Cold War, the U-2 incident, what your father went through. How would you like to consult for the movie? Well, yes, that would be really nice. Thank you for asking. I get the contract, I'm reading through it. Pretty much I'm to answer questions, provide photographs of my family from the 1950s that they can Photoshop, put their actors' heads on. I'm to be on set as requested. At the very end of the contract, the last paragraph, it says, they don't have to listen to me. Very last sentence, if I don't like the end result, I can't sue. No recourse. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, they're going to use the family's name, they're going to tie my hands, and then they're going to do whatever they want to do. So I thought long and hard about what I wanted to do. And at the end of the day, I did sign on the dotted line. I thought it was more important to be a part of the production, try to steer them in the right direction. Otherwise, had I walked away, I'd have had no say whatsoever. So I am very glad that I participated as a consultant on this film. I like the film. The big picture is historically accurate. It accurately portrays the time period of the Cold War, duck and cover drills, civil defense, the tensions between the Soviets and the Americans, the fear of a nuclear war with the Soviets, all very accurately portrayed. And of course, the exchange of my father for Rudolph Abel on the bridge, very accurately portrayed. But that's the big picture. You got to remember, this is Hollywood. They use dramatic effect, they take artistic liberties, they do a little embellishing. So while the big picture is accurate, the details of each scene are not 100% correct. I'm going to show one more quick video from the movie. It's a behind the scenes look at the bridge scene. So I'm going to share my screen. Give me just a moment to make sure I can do that. And we'll start the next little clip, the shooting of the bridge scene for the movie Bridge of Spies.
For me, it was super powerful to be standing on the bridge, the Gleanacher Bridge. It says the Bridge of Spies as you walk up onto that bridge, and it was freezing cold.
Cold. The bridge was freezing. It was, but we were all in it together. And that was our last bit in Berlin, and what a way to go out.
I wouldn't do the dialogue on the walk. We'll do the long dialogue on a side dialogue.
We all reacted to it. I don't think there was a single actor there or a member of the crew that weren't taking into account the fact that this is where incredible history happened. And it had global, international repercussions. And to be there recreating it raises the stakes of what we're doing.
We're going to push it on a nice medium shot of Abel's reaction to see Donovan. And then we're going to dolly back with Abel and then turn into this configuration.
Have you arranged all this for me?
Well, let's see what this is before I take credit for it.
So the movie can be found online. Sometimes it's available on Netflix, Showtime. You can also get copies of the DVD online at eBay if you're interested in watching the movie. I would highly encourage you to watch the movie. It's a great movie. Spielberg and Tom Hanks, how can it not be a great movie? But it can be found online and through those resources. Now I'm going to go over and talk a bit, just before I go into my slideshow presentation, about the 3 books that were referenced. I've done over 30 years of research on the U2 incident and my father to find out the truth of what took place. There's so much misinformation out there saying that my father defected, landed the plane intact, spilled his guts, told the Soviets everything he knew, or hadn't followed orders, all of which were misinformation, disinformation, and or fake news of the time. Over the last 30 years of my research, I discovered 85 of my dad's letters that he wrote from prison. This is his prison cell. Superimposed on top of that is one of his handwritten letters. I was able to transcribe his 85 letters home and those letters he received from his parents, his wife, and his sisters into this book, Letters from a Soviet Prison. It's a primary source document. It's my father's thoughts, his feelings, his hopes and despairs while incarcerated. After 30 years of research and 5 years to write my second book, Spy Pilot, Francis Gary Powers, the U2 Incident, and a Controversial Cold War Legacy, I helped to set the record straight. It takes Dad's reputation from infamy and controversy in the 60s to that of an American hero today. It goes through the behind-the-scenes process as to how he was ultimately, posthumously, awarded the POW medal in 2000 and the Silver Star in 2012. This is the truth of what took place. It puts the misinformation and the fake news of the time in its place. The final book, my most recent one, self-published, came out in August of this year, Enemy Territory. It is a graphic novel. I want to target a younger generation, middle school, high school, college, young adults who are interested in comic books. This is a really good overview of my father, the U2 incident, and what he had gone through. So it's geared towards a younger audience, but adults of all ages will like it. Now, finally, the movie, Bridge of Spies, is based off of two books. First, my dad's book, Operation Overflight, that he writes in 1970, and the other book, Strangers on a Bridge, by James Donovan. James Donovan writes this book in 1965. Between these two books and the fake news of the time, you've got Spielberg's movie, Bridge of Spies. So let's go into the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, one moment. There we go. So here's the U-2 spy plane, the type that my father was flying on May 1st of 1960. We've got the Bridge of Spies graphic information, their promotion for the movie. Bridge of Spies takes place between Francis Gary Powers, my father, and Rudolph Abel. Here's a photo of Rudolph Abel shortly after his capture in the mid-50s. Abel was working as a ground agent. He was a cloak and dagger spy based in New York City. He had snuck in through Canada. He set up shop as an artist, a painter, photographer. He was making a little money doing those type of jobs, but all the while he is funneling microfilm, microfiche, and secrets back home to Mother Russia. My father, Francis Gary Powers, was on the cover of Time magazine on May 16th of 1960 after being shot down over the Soviet Union. At the time, it was the flights were secret. Nobody really knew about them except high up in the echelon of the American government. So when my father was shot down, it was very hard for a lot of people to believe that the Soviets had this technology to shoot down my dad. They had the SA-1 missiles that could only reach 60,000 feet. But between 1955, 56, when the first U-2 flights began, and 1960, when my father was shot down, the Soviets improved their weapon system, created the SA-2 missile that can now reach altitudes of 70,000 feet and above. Here's a photo of the Gleniker Bridge from the west side looking east. There's a very famous sign on the right side that you are leaving the American sector in different languages, basically letting people know that if you go across the bridge, you'll be in the communist nation of East Germany. The Gleniker Bridge separates east and west over the Havel River. Here's a photo that was taken on February 10th of 1962, the date of the spy exchange between my father and Rudolph Abel. When you Google this a date, February 10th of 62, and the spy exchange, this photo will come up. Google seems to think it's of the spy exchange between my father and Abel. It is not. It was taken later that afternoon on the same day. My father was exchanged very early in the morning, about 9 a.m. on February 10th of 62. Rudolph Abel is on one side, the west side, surrounded by his CIA and FBI entourage. My father is on the east side, surrounded by his KGB entourage. They are positively ID'd. They walk home to their respective freedoms. Abel returns home a hero of the Soviet Union, a parade in his honor, postage stamp in his likeness, some medals for his heroics. My dad returns home to controversy. While he's incarcerated, all of this misinformation, the fake news of the time, starts to appear in the press. At the time, I believe it was easier to blame the pilot than to admit America was behind the Soviets in technology. It was easier to blame the pilot than to further embarrass a US president. President Eisenhower had been caught lying to the American public, the world public, as a result of the U-2 incident. Eisenhower said it was a weather research flight. In fact, it was a CIA spy flight. I love this cartoon, a political cartoon of the era, made in February of 1962, right after my father is exchanged for Rudolph Abel. On one side of the bridge is Rudolph Abel. On the other side is my dad, Francis Gary Powers. The tagline that you cannot see on this image says, "Peace through trade." The two books that the movie is made off of, Operation Overflight and Strangers on a Bridge. Here is a behind-the-scenes look at me talking with Austin Stoll. Austin Stoll is the young man who portrayed my father in the movie Bridge of Spies. I'm on set in New York City talking to Austin Stoll and the other members of the crew and cast. Here I am talking with Austin Stoll, as well as Steven Spielberg, getting to know them, talking to them about the history of the U-2 incident, my father, and what he had gone through. After explaining to Mr. Spielberg about how my father was shot down at his assigned altitude of 70,500 feet, we start to go over and discuss how he bailed out of the plane, how his parachute opened, and how he eventually parachuted down to the ground. Here on set, when I'm there at Beale Air Force Base in California, they say, "Hey, Mr. Powers, put on this 1950s vintage suit. We're going to have you escort your father out for the May 1st mission." So I did a little cameo appearance in the movie. It was an honor and a privilege to work with Spielberg, Hanks, Austin Stoll, Mark Reliance, who won an Oscar for his portrayal as Rudolph Abel. It was just, I still can't believe to this day that I actually was part of this historic movie done by Spielberg and Hanks. Here I am talking to another one of the producers at Beale Air Force Base. Beale Air Force Base is near Sacramento, California. It's the home of the U-2 operations today. The movie, when they were doing the filming at Beale, they made it look like Peshawar, Pakistan, which is where my father's flight originated from. And that is an actual U-2 in the background. Here's one of the scenes. Austin Stoll on the right, some other pilots sitting next to him. I'm on the left. I'm portraying a secret agent man, quote unquote, in the movie. And then here's the image of me walking my father out for his May 1st mission. We did some promotion together, some marketing, had some interviews done with Austin Stoll and myself at Beale Air Force Base. And then this picture here, I actually took with my cell phone. It is tradition at the end of filming, when the last scene is done, for a big sheet cake to be wheeled out and champagne to be brought to the crew and cast. Spielberg goes around, he thanks all of his people, his staff, his production assistants. He turns around to me, he raises his glass and toasts my father as a hero to our country. Click, I took this photo with my cell phone. One of my favorite photos I've ever taken. And that is, this next photo is an image to compare and contrast my father, who's on the left side, with Austin Stoll, who's on the right side. The left side picture is of my father while in captivity. The Soviets made him put his helmet and his flight suit, his pressure suit back on. They took this photograph to show that he was alive and well and had been captured in the former Soviet Union. You can tell by my father's expression, he is not happy in this photo. He knows that it's going to be used for propaganda reasons. On the right side, you've got Austin Stoll, the young actor, similar pose, compare, contrast, shows the actual photo, the actual person, and then the actor next to him. Similar, my dad was an Air Force fighter pilot prior to being recruited for the U-2 program. He was flying F-84s out of Turner Air Force Base near Albany, Georgia, between 1952 and 1956. This is a promotional photo that all the pilots took at the time that Austin Stoll then tries to recreate in front of the U-2. So that is a quick overview, a little bit about the U-2 incident, my father, the movie Bridge of Spies that portrays my father's exchange for Rudolph Abel in February 10th of 1962, and just a little background about my history and my heritage. If anybody would like to reach me, you can reach me at garypowers.com. If you're interested in learning more about Cold War history, you can reach the Cold War Museum through coldwar.org. And then I do want to take a moment to let people know I run spy tours of Washington, D.C. If you'd like to bring a group of people, 30 to 50 people, charter a bus, I will arrange this to go around to drop points, safe houses, and other clandestine locations where spies were caught, captured, or killed. We'll have briefings on Civil War espionage up through modern times. We'll go by homes such as Alger Hess's home, Wild Bill Donovan's home. We'll go to drop points used by Aldrich Ames and or Robert Hansen. So it's a very unique tour. You can get more information about that at spytour.com. And finally, I'm doing my first European tour, March 19th through March 28th of 2023. It's going to be a Cold War espionage tour of Germany and the Czech Republic. We'll go by drop points, safe houses, underground bunkers, the Stasi headquarters, the Alliette Museum, the Berlin Wall Museum. We have to make a stop at the Pilsen Brewery in the Czech Republic, of course. But again, we're going to go to bunkers, fallout shelters, military installations, have briefings on these locations by experts in the field. So if anybody's interested in joining me, please reach out to me through garypowers.com. Thank you very much for having me on today for this program. I'll look forward to hearing what Andrew Hammond, Dr. Hammond has to say now.
Thank you ever so much, Gary. It's always a pleasure to be on with you. So I'm just going to discuss some of the similarities and differences between the time of your father and where we are today. But just before I do that, Gary, I just wondered if I could ask you, I know that you've spent a lot of time in Russia and the former Soviet Union. You have a network there. I don't expect you to mention any names and so forth, but just as someone who's spent a lot of your life thinking about East and West and that exchange between your father and Rudolph Abel, would you be willing to share your views on the current shift in U.S Russian relations?
Well, let me tell you a
No
little
question.
story.
Sorry.
A little story. My former graduate school roommate from George Mason University is Ukrainian. He is in Kiev right now with his elderly parents. He could not get out. He could not get them out. I have friends in Russia, one of which hosted me in December of 2017 in Yekaterinburg, which is the city where my father was shot down over. Actually Sverdlovsk at the time, but it's been renamed to Yekaterinburg. And of course, along the ways, I have friends in the intelligence community, including a retired KGB operative. So when the war broke out in February of this year, a couple of weeks go by, I write an email to all of them basically saying the same thing. How are you doing? Are you okay? Is there anything I can do to help? What's your opinion? What are your feelings about what's going on? My Ukrainian roommate, my friend, said, Zelensky is just as corrupt as the others. All of the oligarchs have left with the money, and it's leaving the normal citizens in these cities that didn't have the means to get out. My Russian friend And Yekaterinburg basically hook, line, and sinker regurgitated all of the state propaganda. It's a special operation. They're fighting the Nazis. They're helping the Russians in Crimea. My KGB friend said, if I tell you my true feelings, they'll throw me in jail. So you've got this very unique dichotomy, an average Russian with a KGB person. She knows what's going on. He was believing everything he read in the press. My Ukrainian friend has this assumption that Zelensky's government is as corrupt as the previous one. The previous one was pro-Russia. Zelensky is pro-West, hence butting of heads. My Ukrainian friend also told me, which I was unaware of, and I'm fairly well read, that the last 8 years, there's been a civil war in the Ukraine. Russian backing one side, other countries backing Zelensky. So this civil war has been going on for 8 years. Putin invades Ukraine. It didn't just happen overnight. It's been festering for the last 8 years.
Wow. So I think there's quite a bit that I would like to discuss, but it's good to hear your take on the situation. So one of the things that I think is very similar between the time of your father and now is people make analyses based on their prevailing assumptions of the other side's capabilities or intent and so forth. And I don't think that's something that we ever get beyond. So your father, for example, it was deemed to be safe for him to do this because the assumption was that there weren't surface-to-air missiles that could reach his plane. But of course, we know later that that wasn't the case. You can look at op-eds or articles in the newspapers or speeches and statements where people in early February or January of this year saying, you know, Russia won't invade Ukraine. It's not on their cost-benefit analysis, etc. So I think that the role that assumptions play in how certain you are of your analyses, I think to me is really, really important. So, and I think that your father's flight is a great example of that. It's going to be fine. The surface-to-air missiles won't get there. Well, actually, what the US doesn't know that they actually can get there, and that's where your father comes into the picture. So really, really fascinating. Another thing that I think is quite similar between then and now is it depends on who you ask, but I think there's quite often the assumption that the Russians are 10 feet tall. So back when your father was shot down, we see some of this as well. We see it in the 70s. We hear it now, especially with regards to cyber, which is one of the differences. There's this sense that Russia's just 10 feet tall when it comes to cyber operations. So I think that's another thing that goes on, which is interesting and which would take some time to unpack. I think one of the things that is similar as well is at the current juncture, we see societies like Russia, like China, exploiting the openness of American society or the openness of the West. So this is something that many people have thought about, but the openness of America is part of what makes it great. Mm-hmm. But from an intelligence perspective or from a certain point of view, that also makes it more vulnerable. So we see this in the news all the time. If you just type espionage in your computer, click news, you'll just see Chinese economic espionage, Russian espionage, so forth. So there's just all of these instances against the United States, which many of them are within this environment of a relatively open society.
You make a very good point there.
Yeah, sorry.
In regards to a democracy. In a democracy, freedom of the press. We write these stories. We found out about the, what is it called? The Watergate break-in, the Pentagon Papers. These things become public knowledge once a reporter does his due diligence. In a communist country, they control the press. They control the narrative as to what they get out. So back in the 1950s, Khrushchev is saying we have more bombers, we have more missiles, we're going to bury you. That worried our generals and our leaders in America. Eisenhower wanted to find out what their strengths and weaknesses were, which is why he developed the U-2 program. We could not get ground agents into the Soviet Union as easily as they could get ground agents into America. In open society, we can travel across the nation without being stopped. In the Soviet Union, you had to have certain papers and credentials to get to certain cities, or else you could be picked up. So this is why the Eisenhower administration developed the U-2 program, was to fly over the country taking photographs to find out the strengths and weaknesses of our adversary.
And I think that's a great point, and it also ties into the role that technology has played in American intelligence. So if it's a denied area, if it's a hard target, if it's difficult to do human intelligence operations there, why don't we just come up with the technology to fly an aircraft twice the height of a commercial airline so that it's going to be safe from the surface to air missiles, so that we can gather intelligence? And that, of course, ties into the story of the U-2. But I think that this is definitely part of what's going on at the moment. Some of the differences, which I think are quite important, and I don't, I'm going to speak for another 5 minutes or so, but I want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions. But some of the differences as I see it. So whereas when your father was around, and I mean this in this is just a way to try to convey the information, but we're talking about a bipolar world. We're talking about the Soviet Union and the United States really as the two major superpowers. No one else really comes close. But now, I don't think Russia is as strong as it was then. Obviously, it was the Soviet Union then, but even just as Russia, I don't think it's as strong as it was then, but it still has many of the same offensive capabilities in terms of nuclear missiles and so forth. But what we see now is China is strong. We've got the war in Ukraine. We've got Taiwan that are in the news a lot today. And if it's not too irreverent, I think that if you think about the era of your father and now, it's like the era of your father was like Federer and Nadal. And the era that we're in now is Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic, but one of the other ones is not as good as they once were. So the situation is just it's a bit more complicated. I think another one that is quite interesting just now is thinking about corruption. So during the Cold War, the KGB intelligence, generally speaking, was seen as a part of Soviet society that wasn't as tainted by corruption as other parts of Soviet society. But I think what we see now in Russia is, we see many of these, of course, former intelligence officers and so forth, but corruption is very much part of the story that we're witnessing now. And then another difference, just to wrap up, another difference that I see is, let's look at the precedents for where we are now in terms of spy swaps, or in terms of your father and Rudolf Abel. Mm-hmm. So we've got your father, so flying over Soviet airspace and taking intelligence imagery of the Soviet Union, CIA flight. So he's very much in the game, if we want to put it like that. Then just a few years later, Greville Wynne, a British businessman, he's recruited by MI6 to help them work with a Soviet intelligence officer who's working for the West called Oleg Penkovsky. Mm-hmm. He gets arrested and put in jail, and he becomes part of a spy swap with Conan Molody, who's a Russian spy, a Soviet spy in Great Britain, who's set up a spy ring to spy on British submarine technology. So we've still got, on the Soviet side, we've still got an intelligence officer, but they're exchanged for a businessman. So if you think about your father, very much in the game, he's suited up. Then we've got a businessman who's he's in it because he's involved in intelligence operations, but he's not an MI6. He's not a trained intelligence officer. He's not in the game in that way. But then when we come to the present day,
Mm-hmm.
Brittney Griner, who, you know, we're talking about a basketball player who's supposedly caught with some marijuana, which of course is legal in many states in this country anyway. So we see this in the news at the moment. We hear people talking about precedents and so forth. And sure, at one level, it's one human being in exchange for another. But if we look at this in terms of, say, intelligence or espionage, I mean, Brittney Griner is not even remotely in the game. This is something very different. So I think that for me, this shows some of the erosion of some of the almost informal rules that were there during the Cold War, where the Moscow rules, where spies, intelligence agencies were, you know, they played rough, but generally speaking, there was an unwritten code that was used to, you know, help manage this world of intelligence and spying. But I feel like now that anyway, under the Putin regime, that has eroded, and now we're in a very different environment. So I'm sure, as a fellow historian, I think that history is very, very important for helping us understand the present. But I think that you have to make sure that you don't draw the wrong assumptions from the wrong examples. And I just think that if we think about your father, Greville Wynne and Brittney Griner, we're talking about apples, pears, and oranges.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's some thoughts that I have on what you were saying, and yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you. And you touched on a very good point. Back in the Cold War days, my dad and the spy exchange between him and Rudolph Abel was the very first Cold War spy exchange. Then there were several others up through the 80s and into the early prior to the fall of the Soviet Union. So it was at one point in time espionage related. Specifically espionage related, spy versus spy, spy trade for spy. Now, over the years, we've traded business people for spies. We're trading basketball players for arm dealers. We're trading people that are maybe normal citizens, some that are very nefarious, others that are very well-to-do or very famous. And it's a political exchange versus a spy exchange. So it's just the way that these governments are now working with each other to try to get their citizens back and try to save face at the same time.
And I think just before Jane comes in, I think that one thing that's really interesting here as well is thinking about the role that Congress plays, since this is a U.S. Capitol Historical Society event. So when your father was around, there was no House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. There was no Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. The oversight was very different than when we have the Church and Pike Committee hearings. In the 70s, we have these new legislative committees and chairmen and so forth who provide oversight and sometimes get involved in the intelligence game themselves. So I think that this would probably be something for a future event, but it'd be quite interesting to think about people on the Hill as intelligence actors. And how they get involved in these types of events, whether it be congressmen working to try to free people or former governors and so forth, how they get caught up in this world of intelligence, espionage, diplomacy, and so forth. But yeah, I think we're living in very interesting times.
Oh yes.
Well, you both have said an interesting perspective, and we've got a pile of questions. And I think, Andrew, you really set up the conversation about the role of Congress in trying to deal with misinformation, trying to deal with international relations. And Gary, you spoke when we were talking in the prep session about the Congressional oversight hearing that was held with your father following his return, and that was about a 6-hour hearing attempting to root out the facts. If you could just give us a little bit of information, was that a special committee? Because as Andrew said, there was not a select committee at that time.
So this was, I thought it was a Senate Select Committee. I don't think it was intelligence at the time, but it was a Senate Select Committee that reviewed the U-2 incident. It took place on March 6th of 1962. When my father was exchanged on February 10th of 62, he comes home. He's debriefed by the CIA for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks of debriefings, they realized he did everything he was supposed to do. He followed his orders to a T. Then he has to appear before the Senate Select Committee. Some of the members were Prescott Bush, President Bush's grandfather, Barry Goldwater out of Arizona, Dick Russell, that the House office building is named after now, as well as Al Gore Sr. Those were the type of senators at the time that were on this committee. And so after 8 hours or so of deliberations, questions back and forth, they give my father a standing ovation. They pat him on the back. Good job for your country. He's been exonerated by the U.S. Senate. He's been cleared by the CIA. But because of the misinformation and the fake news of the time, he's not yet been cleared by the court of public opinion. And that wouldn't take place until many years later. Even today, however, because of the internet, where everything is true, people will read stuff online and think that my father failed his country. But that's one of the reasons I wrote these books, is to help set the record straight.
I believe it was the Armed Services Committee your father appeared before.
Thank you, Armed Services Committee, that is correct.
And Andrew, you've been looking at this whole question of Russian-American relations. And could you share with us, how has the U.S. government historically valued American and Russian prisoners? What type of person would likely be a priority in an exchange? And have Russians changed who's a priority as the time has gone on?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I think that if we just look at the spy swaps that Gary was speaking about, and then we come up to Brittney Griner at the present, I think we're, on one level, every American's life is equally valuable, right? And morally, that's true, but quite often in the world of diplomacy, a president would generally be treated as more important to try to, and some potential prisoner swap, say a president would be seen as more important than an average citizen. So I think that one of the things that we see is that there's a couple of things going on. I think sometimes it's a great way to get our people back. Sometimes it's a great PR victory. Sometimes there's so much pressure that comes from within the country or from the Hill that it's something that's put to the top of the agenda. So it really depends on the particular context that we're speaking about. But I think that we see a whole variety of examples going from Gary's father through to where we are now. But I think Gary's father is like a great example of someone who was very much in the game exchanged for someone who was very much in the game. And then speaking about intelligence, and then we can come down to, well, just private citizens who've been wrongfully imprisoned, like Brittney Griner, and then that's something different.
Do you have any opinion about whether Brittney Griner is being held for more than just being an American? I mean, Russia is a country with a history of antagonism toward gay rights. And do you have any sense that Putin is trying to make an example of her because of her sexual orientation?
I don't have information to hand to. I would just be giving you literally an opinion, not based on any hard evidence other than circumstantial evidence. And I think that the circumstantial evidence, as you say, it's certainly convincing to some degree.
And Gary, can you tell us, you knew your father before he went on this covert mission, and you knew him after his return. Were there differences in who he was or how you perceived him upon his return?
Well, let me clarify a little bit. I was not yet born when my father was shot down. I was born 2 years after he came home from prison. But I can answer your question based on talking to my mother and relatives and even my dad before he passed away. My dad was a very humble individual. He was not the stereotypic fighter, jet jockey, chip on his shoulder. He was very mild-mannered. He was very soft-spoken. He did not come across as an egotistical, I'm the best fighter pilot ever type of person. When he was in jail in the Soviet Union for a total of 21 months, he lost 20 to 30 pounds. His lifeline home was his letters to his family. That was the only way he could keep in touch with those he loved. They would send him photographs, they would send him letters, they'd send him little care packages. He could not get access to Western press. He could get Pravda, that his cellmate translated. He could get copies of the Daily Worker, a socialist newspaper out of the UK. He could read any book by Jack London, a socialist author, but he could not get Time, Newsweek, Washington Post, or anything like that. So he was aware of what was going on in the world, but it was always from a socialist or Soviet perspective. I've read his diary. I've read his journal, which is part of the book Letters from a Soviet Prison. And his mental stability was starting to falter after those 21 months. One of the very last passages in his journal was basically saying he needs help, he can't get it, he's looking at another 8.5 years in prison, and he's already starting to deteriorate mentally, having it affect him negatively because of the incarceration in the former Soviet Union. He was exchanged about 2 weeks after his last journal entry. When he gets home, after the debriefings, after the Senate committee hearing, things like that, he starts to work for the CIA, but continues to work for the CIA, but at this time a desk job. He's training agents on what to do if captured, how to go through an interrogation, how to appear to cooperate when in fact you're not giving the enemy any information of value. My mother told me that during this time period, when they started to date, my mom is my dad's second wife, he would have some night frights, PTSD, where he would jump up in the middle of the night, cold sweat, thinking he was back in the Soviet prison cell. He'd look around, he'd get his bearings, I'm back home. He'd go back to bed. Those night frights did subside. If they had not, he could not have continued to be a pilot. He went on to be an aircraft pilot for Lockheed Skunk Works as a test pilot for Kelly Johnson for 7 years. Then he went on to fly Cessnas and helicopters for radio and television stations back in the early 70s. So if he had not fully recovered from his ordeal in the Soviet Union, he would not have been able to continue to fly. So there was no long-term lasting effects, only short-term.
And Andrew, can you tell us, there's stories abound that the United States supposedly offered the Merchant of Death as part of a proposed prisoner swap. Do you know about that proposal and why did it not go through?
I do know about the proposal. I think that on one level, it's one human being for another human being, but at another level, we're talking about a law-abiding basketball player, a young woman who was there in Russia who gets arrested versus, the Merchant of Death. So we're not really comparing apples and apples in that particular case. Why it didn't go through, I think there's a number of reasons for that. One thing that I just wanted to draw out today compared to Gary, the time period of Gary's father being shot down, there was a degree of bipartisan consensus across the government during the Cold War to a much higher degree. There was a consensus around how the Soviet Union should be approached. There was differences over strategy and so forth, but Kennedy and Nixon were both opposed to the Soviet system. Carter and Reagan were both opposed to the Soviet system. Charlie Wilson and Gordon Humphrey were both opposed to the Soviet system. I think that what we're seeing a little bit now is, I avoid politics like it's the Black Death, but I think that just if you read the newspapers, it's you can definitely, it's people are on the record as saying that, Russia's X or Russia's Y. There's the interpretation surrounding Russia, what Vladimir Putin's doing, etc. There's not the same consensus as there was during the time when Gary's father was shot down. And I think that you also can see that in terms of disinformation. So by and large, any congressperson in 1960s would have opposed attempts by the Soviet Union to put its thumb on the scale of American society or the American political system. Now we're having, we're having some people from on the Hill, depending on who you ask, offer information up that's not verified and has turned out in some cases not to be true. So I guess that coalescence of people from both parties, the Senate, the Congress, all the branches of government, that center ground of American politics has shifted, which I think is quite interesting because that is important for the conduct of foreign policy as well. It was, when Gary's father was shot down, that was under a particular assumption surrounding how America should orientate itself in the world. I think what we're seeing now is less consensus surrounding that. And as a non-American, but someone who has an American wife and an American daughter, that's something that I worry about because I want America to be strong and free for the sake of my daughter. So I think that this is important. But like I say, I avoid politics like the plague, especially since I represent the Spy Museum. But I think more generally, the work that the U.S. Capitol Historical Society do with events like this to try to have productive conversations about the role of Congress and America's role in the world, I think are really, really important. And I think that you are doing the Lord's work.
Well, Andrew, thank you. We are coming to the end of our allotted time. We've got some questions in the queue, and both Andrew and Gary have agreed to stay on past the 1 o'clock hour. And so I want to take a quick minute to thank everybody who's come. If you want to stay on, we can have a lightning round. We've got several questions we'll go through, but we do want to alert you to the upcoming events for the Capitol Historical Society. Andrew, thank you for your kind words about us, because as we look forward, there are some interesting events coming up, and Sam can put the upcoming events. We have in 2 weeks, on November 17th, we have one of the last living Navajo code talkers who's going to talk with us. And we really are very interested in having you join us for that conversation. We are then in the run-up to Thanksgiving on Tuesday, the 22nd of November, going to talk about how did Thanksgiving become a national holiday? And our own Senate chaplain, as we return from Thanksgiving, has written a book called Prayer for Our Country, which is designed to be for young people. And he is going to join the Capitol Kids conversation. Capitol Kids, for those who don't know, of course, adults are certainly welcome, but it is really geared for classrooms to tune in, and we pay special attention for the questions and answers to questions that come from the students that are typed in by the students themselves or by the teachers. So that's coming on Tuesday, the 29th. And then we return to our amendments series, where we look at the amendments to the Constitution, the context in which they were passed at the time and how they have been interpreted over time. We are honored to have for one of our favorite historical scholars, Dr. Joanne Friedman from Yale, who is going to join us and talk about party wars and the need for the 12th Amendment. All of these are available. There's a QR code. You can scan that, or you can just simply go to our website and get all of that information. So we really want to thank you for being here. We want to remind you that as the holiday season comes upon us, one of the ways you can support the Capitol Historical Society is by ordering commemorative merchandise. We have some amazing ornaments, bookends, and specialty items that remind people how important the Capitol in American democracy is, that you can use for gifts for family members, corporate gifts, and whatever else. So we say that because all of these come to you only because of the generosity of our members and guests. And so we thank you for your contributions and for your engagement. And now we return to the bonus round of our questions. And so let's just try to do kind of a quick theory. Are the U2 still being used for the same purposes after all these years? If you can each just answer as quickly as possible.
Well, the easy answer is yes. They are still being flown on missions around the world. The U-2s flying today were developed in the late 70s and early 80s. They were first known as the TR-1s. U-2 had the spy plane stigma. They tried to get away from that. They renamed it the TR-1. But if it looks like a U-2 and flies like a U-2 and spies like a U-2, it's a U-2. They're headquartered at Beale Air Force Base in California.
Dr. Hammond, you have anything to add about U-2s?
No, I think Gary's hit the nail on the head. Yeah, and some other spy planes that were built after the U-2 went out of commission, and the U-2 has outlived them. So I think it says something about the success of the technology.
So now, next question, we're going to start with you, Andrew. Do you think there's a danger now that you have identified, when you used your tennis analogy, Russia was less strong than it was, in the 60s during the Cold War. Do you think there's a danger that a less strong Russia might resort to nuclear weapons just to prove how strong they are on the world stage?
I mean, I think that there's always dangers of nuclear weapons being used, and I think that you should never underestimate the role that insecurity, identity, a feeling of needing to prove yourself, all of those things, the roles that they have played in history are monumental. There's many human beings that died prematurely because of those factors, people wanting to prove themselves, not wanting to appear weak, wanting to appear strong. There's the thing about people overcompensating and so forth. So I mean, it's like a difficult thing to apply to Russia. It's like, it's a complex society. There's a lot going on there, but the Putin era and the Putin regime has a particular hold over that country at the moment, and I think that there's definitely a danger. I don't think that you need to build your bomb shelter this afternoon, but it's not like completely it's not completely beyond the pale that this could happen. I mean, obviously I hope it really doesn't, because it's not going to be good for anyone.
No. All right, let me
certainly not if you live in Washington, DC.
Right. Gary, why don't you take this one? It's interesting to note that the KGB permitted your father to write and receive letters and to keep a journal and to take the journal with him. Do you have a perspective on why those activities were allowed?
Well, I do. I know when I first got access to my dad's letters, none of them were censored. So I thought none of them were censored. But then I was able to listen to my dad's audio tapes. And in the audio tapes, my father basically says the following. During the first 3 months, while he's in the KGB prison Lubyanka, they do encourage him to write letters home. They want to show the world how nice they are, how humble they are. They're using it as a propaganda reason. The Americans did not allow Rudolph Abel to write letters home, fearful that he would put some type of code in and communicate with his superiors. My father, for the first 3 months, was allowed to write letters home to his wife and his parents, but they were censored. He would write the first letter, they would review it. Move this here, take this sentence out, move this sentence here, rewrite the letter. So it was the second or the third draft that would be sent home to his parents, looking as if it had not been censored. The reason that they did this was not to, they didn't care what he was saying per se. They wanted to disrupt the sequence in which he was saying it, to disrupt any type of a code that he was attempting to put in. Now, my father was taught how to do a basic code, but in order to do it, you have to have some privacy. You can't have people looking over you. You've got to set up a grid in the sheet, A equals B, B equals C, something to that effect, or every fifth letter or every fifth word, and you can do a code. But my father was never able to do that type of a communication for fear that he would be caught doing it. So he would write letters home just to get the correspondence back and forth to his parents and his wife. After his trial, for the next 18 months when he's in Vladimir prison with his cellmate, he continues to be able to write letters home. He can write 5 letters per month. He can receive as many letters as are sent to him. So he's very careful as to who he writes his letters to, primarily mom, dad, sisters, wife. In those letters, none of them were censored. He was able to write freely, but he wasn't putting anything in them to jeopardize this privilege. That was his lifeline home. The journal he kept, I'm sure, and my dad was sure, when he was out in the courtyard doing an exercise or whatever they were doing outside the cell, people would come in and read through it to see what he was saying. But he never put anything in there that would be detrimental or upset the authorities. He did do a couple of sentences to trigger a memory that he didn't want to put in writing, so that when he got back home, he would remember his thoughts of the time. So I believe that it was part propaganda to show the world how nice the Soviets were. They allowed Gary Powers to write home. They allowed him to keep a journal. The Americans did not do the same for Rudolph Abel.
Now, Andrew, when Gary was giving his original presentation, he posited that one of the reasons the media sort of raised the question about was his dad somehow doing something incorrect, was because President Eisenhower had said it was a weather plane, and the integrity of the president the media didn't want to challenge the integrity of the president. Do you have any perspective of yours as a scholar about why the media, put Gary Powers in such a difficult situation?
I mean, I think that one of the explanations is that because of the nature of intelligence and espionage, a lot of information people don't want to disclose, they don't want to reveal. So people end up drawing a line between A and C and not really knowing that B exists. Or there can be a whole variety of things that go wrong that just happen within this vacuum of information. And in fact, not long after Gary's father shot down in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is just the anniversary has just passed there. We all know, or many of us know, of the famous photographs that the U.S spy plane took over Cuba of the medium-range ballistic missile launch sites. but they were actually discovered by human intelligence operators on the ground. But for decades, they were attributed to the U-2s because they wanted to protect the human intelligence operators on the ground. So even at the level of official government explanation, to protect operations, it's attributed to A, but actually it was B. So this is one of the challenges of studying intelligence and espionage. You may not find out the full story until 50 or 60 years later. And unfortunately, many people's reputations are collateral damage along the way until the truth finally comes out. But I know that that's something Gary spent a lot of his life working against.
Mm-hmm. If I could piggyback on that, yeah, Dad's reputation was tarnished at the time because of the misinformation, the fake news. I attribute it to some armchair generals, people sitting in their living room, seeing the news report, saying, oh, he should have done this, oh, he should have done that. If I was there, I would have done it this way. Well, they weren't there. They're assuming. And to my father's detriment, there were some congressional people, there were some media people, there were politicians who had said publicly that my dad was a traitor, that he landed the plane, that he defected. I mean, not knowing the full truth, but it made for a good soundbite. It made for a good headline, to my dad's detriment. Now, back in the 60s when this happened, my father was not able to defend himself while he was in prison. He didn't really know the extent of the negative press that was out there until he got back home. But my father was the type of individual who didn't really care what other people thought he should or should not have done. He knew that he did everything he was supposed to do according to how he was instructed to do it. He followed his orders to a T. He did everything he was supposed to do. And when he was debriefed by the CIA, they realized he followed his orders.
And I think just really briefly, Jane, just to bring this all full circle, I think that if you think about the nature of American society, so the open society, free speech, political contest, political debate, if you've got 535 people in Congress, if you just think of any grouping of 535 people, you're going to have all different types of opinions. Some people there's going to be Lee Hamiltons in there. There's going to be the old school straight shooters who, are classy. And then there's going to be people that just want to be heard or are happy to become a bit more demagogic just so they can win an election or so that they can cut a figure within a particular grouping. So it's to some extent, this is just what you'd expect from any grouping of 535 people. But I think that that's part of it as well. There's a lot of people there, and you can always say, well, one member of Congress said this. You can probably always find one member of Congress to say pretty much anything. Elephants can walk on string or something like that. Because there's a lot of people there and there's a lot of diversity. But I think that what's important is the center ground, that there's some kind of coalescence there around what is verifiable, what is factual, what actually happened. I think that there's always going to be people out on the fringes saying stuff, but I think that it's when the center ground gets smaller and smaller, and then there's just people not saying things that are corroborated. I think that that's when the Iran study called truth decay, I think that's when that begins. When you have members of Congress, when that center ground is so shrunken and truth begins to decay, then the public don't know what's going on. The public are very busy. They have to make assumptions about all types of things on a daily basis, about the nature of immigration, education, healthcare, etc. I'm a scholar and I don't have time to sit and read everything I would love to read just about foreign policy. So people have to make these shorthand assumptions about the nature of the world, and quite often they take their lead from the media or from people on the Hill. And I think that that's something to bear in mind, that these voices are important and they can shape things. They can shape how Gary's father is interpreted. They can shape how American foreign policy is interpreted. So I think that, words really, really matter in an open society that's based on debate, free speech, and ideas. And I think that that's just something that I would offer up as being important to where we are just now.
Well, Dr. Hammond, you are perfect last word, because that is really the work of the Capitol Historical Society, is to offer open debate, factual information. And we are so grateful for your time, your talent. Gary, we're grateful for your time and the work that you've done. We are always grateful to Sam Holliday and Yanni Varanis, who have really worked to bring these programs to light. So thank you so very much for being with us. We look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Be well. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.